Now you are single. I'm officially divorcing you. The words came out of my mouth like sharp blades, cutting the air between us. She looked at me, motionless, her fork frozen halfway between her plate and her mouth. The lover beside her tensed, eyes wide, not knowing what to do. The candles flickered on the table, casting treacherous shadows across their faces. I knew. I knew everything. The lies, the empty excuses, the averted looks. I knew that every "I'm tired" hid something more. I knew that cell phone she never put down wasn't just for work. I knew. But it was one thing to be suspicious, it was another thing to be there, in front of her, seeing with my own eyes the woman I loved choosing another man. For a second, the entire restaurant seemed to go silent. I felt the eyes on me, curious, embarrassed, shocked. But I didn't care. Betrayal was a pain that burned inside me, a fire that consumed every memory, every touch, every kiss that I ever shared with that woman. I wanted to scream, I wanted to destroy everything around me, I wanted to tear away that mask of innocence that she was still trying to hold on to her face. But I didn't do any of that. I stood there, steady, as she blinked rapidly, trying to process what was happening. The lover next to him shifted in his chair, not having the courage to look at me. He knew what he had done. He knew he had slept with a married woman. And now, he was trapped in that moment, with no way out, no justification. You. Did you follow me? She finally managed to say, her voice shaking. There was no more lie that could save her, there was no more excuse she could come up with. Did you follow me? She repeated, as if wanting to cling to the idea that I was the villain for having discovered her betrayal, and not she, the one to blame for having committed it. I didn't have to follow you, I replied, feeling the bitter taste of humiliation in my mouth. You gave yourself away. Did you think I would never find out? That your lies were perfect? That I would never realize you were no longer the woman I married? I gave you everything. Everything. And this is what I get in return. She was silent. Maybe he would try to think of a way out, a way to reverse that situation, to minimize the damage. But there was no way out. There was no reversal. There was no way to fix what was done. Because there, at that moment, I was no longer the husband who had once loved her with all the strength of my being. I was a broken man, and a broken man feels no mercy. I loved you, I continued, my voice lower but filled with a pain that was impossible to ignore. I would have done anything for you. But you chose to throw it all away. So now you're alone. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The lover beside him lowered his head, as if he wanted to disappear. The silence between us was interrupted by a waiter who approached hesitantly, not knowing whether he should intervene. I didn't wait any longer. I took the ring from my finger and placed it on the table, right in front of her. It doesn't mean anything anymore, I declared, taking one last look at the woman who was once my wife. I turned and left. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the restaurant. I could feel her breathing quicken, I could imagine the panic in her eyes. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that when I walked out that door, I would leave everything we were behind. And maybe, just maybe, that would be my only victory. But the story doesn't end here. Betrayal is not just a temporary pain. It is an earthquake that destroys everything around, that uproots what was built, that changes lives forever. I thought only my heart had been broken. I thought my pain was the only consequence. But I was mistaken. Because her betrayal didn't just destroy our marriage. She destroyed something much bigger. And the worst was yet to come. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not and will never support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry an undeniable truth: betrayal destroys lives, families and souls. Our goal is to show the real consequences of disloyalty and the high price that lies exact. Get ready, because the story that comes next is intense, full of twists and turns and could change the way you see love and trust. Now, open your mind and prepare for a shocking story. The night was cold, but inside that house, a home built over the years with love and dedication, the warmth was comforting. He sat on the sofa in the living room, his eyes glued to his cell phone screen, absent-mindedly scrolling through work messages. He was a dedicated man, a present husband, someone who always put his family above all else. Your marriage with Sophie, it had been, for a long time, the foundation of his life. They had met in college, when he still dreamed of building his own company and she was looking to establish herself in the advertising market. They had been young people in love, full of promises and plans, and somehow, even after so many years, Ethan believed that love remained solid, unshakable. Sophie had always been a charming woman, one of those who attracted glances wherever she went, not just because of her beauty, but because of the way she spoke, how she moved, how she lit up a room with her presence. Ethan had always been proud to have her by his side, and even after years of marriage, he still found himself admiring her as she walked across the room, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders, her eyes shining with that mix of intelligence and mystery that had hooked him from the beginning. But there was something about her lately, a subtle detachment, almost imperceptible to anyone on the outside, but for him, who knew her like no one else, it was impossible to ignore. Her touch seemed colder, her kisses were quicker, and her looks, once intense and full of meaning, were now fleeting, as if she was hiding something, as if she were always somewhere else, even though she was there, by his side. Their routine was always something Ethan cherished. He liked coming home and seeing her preparing dinner, he liked the nights when they would lie down together and talk about the day, he liked the weekend trips they took from time to time to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. He felt safe, comfortable in that life, in the certainty that he had someone who shared his dreams and walked alongside him. But now, the silence between them seemed longer, heavier. Sophie, who had always been a woman of words, was now limited to short answers and automatic smiles. It wasn't an obvious separation, it wasn't a fight, there was no shouting or arguing. Just a gradual separation, an invisible thread that was slowly breaking, without him understanding why. There were moments when Ethan wondered if it was just his imagination, if he wasn't exaggerating, if the natural wear and tear of time wasn't just a common cycle in long relationships. But then there were those moments when he would see her on the phone, smiling in a different way, a way that was no longer for him. There were the messages she never made visible, the small unexplained delays, the work events that suddenly became more frequent. He tried not to think too much, he tried not to create paranoia for no reason, but his heart wouldn't let him ignore the signs. Something was changing, and he didn't know how to stop it from pushing them further apart. Sophie had always been independent, something Ethan loved about her. She had never been the type of woman who lived for her husband, she had always had her own career, her own ambitions. He never wanted to control her, never wanted to limit her freedom. But lately, it seemed like that freedom was taking her away from him, away from what they'd built together. She spent more time outside, she seemed to be always busy, always having some excuse not to be present in the little moments that used to matter so much. He wondered if it was his fault, if it had stopped being interesting, if the comfort he valued so much hadn't become a boring routine for her. But how could it be? They had a story, they had a life built with so much effort, with so much love. Their friends always saw them as the perfect couple. "You guys are so lucky," they said, "it doesn't even feel like you've been married that long." And he liked to hear that, he liked to believe that it was true, that love would weather any storm. But Sophie no longer seemed so involved in these little happinesses. The sparkle in her eyes, the one that was once just his, seemed to be directed towards something else, something he couldn't see. Maybe he was just tired, overwhelmed with work, maybe he was seeing problems where none existed. But his heart said otherwise. His heart told him something was wrong. And he didn't know how much longer he could pretend he didn't notice. That particular night, Sophie arrived later than usual. The sound of the key turning in the lock brought him out of his thoughts, and he turned to see her enter, coat thrown over her arm, cell phone clutched tightly in her other hand. She smiled when she saw him, but it was a quick, rehearsed smile. "Hi, love," he said, as he walked up to him and kissed him on the forehead, an automatic gesture, without the depth of before. "Hi," he replied, observing her closely, trying to find in her some trace of the woman he had married. "How was work?" "Running. I had a meeting that went on longer than expected." "Total chaos, but everything went well," he replied, throwing his bag on the sofa and walking to the kitchen to get a glass of water. He watched her for a moment, trying to decide if he should ask anything else, if he should try to pull her back to him somehow. But Sophie always seemed in a hurry, always running away. Before he could say anything, she was already picking up her cell phone again, typing quickly before placing the device face down on the table. He suppressed the urge to ask who she was texting, to ask her to look him in the eye and tell the truth. But he just took a deep breath, feeling that the distance between them grew more and more every day, and that he was powerless in the face of it. Ethan wanted to believe this was all just a phase. He wanted to believe that Sophie still loved him, that things would go back to the way they were. But deep down, he knew that some things, when they're broken, never get the same again. He just wasn't ready to admit it yet. He wasn't ready to face the truth that was already beginning to emerge before him. And perhaps he wasn't prepared for what came next. Time seemed to drag cruelly by Ethan. The days passed, but the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers grew more and more. The restlessness became a constant presence, something that didn't leave him even in the moments when he tried to convince himself that it was all just unfounded paranoia. Sophie, he continued his routine, as if nothing had changed. She smiled when necessary, kept her commitments, gave mechanical answers to the questions he asked at dinner, but there was a gulf between the two that seemed impossible to ignore. And Ethan didn't want to turn a blind eye any longer. Something inside him screamed for answers, a suffocating need to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. The nights became too long, and sleep became a scarce luxury. He would find himself rolling over in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling Sophie next to him, but at the same time so far away. She slept facing the other side, almost as if avoiding contact, and every little detail like that was like a blade cutting deep. He began to notice the patterns, the moments when she left and came back later than usual, the longer showers, the cell phone always close by, but never within Ethan's reach. The way she typed quick messages and deleted her history, as if she feared any trace would be left behind. The way she dressed up more than usual, as if something inside her had been reborn, but not for him. Distrust began to corrode everything around him, to transform every previously insignificant detail into a piece of a puzzle of which he didn't have the complete picture. He tried to ignore it, tried to occupy his mind with work, tried to convince himself that maybe he was being unfair, that maybe he was just exaggerating. But every attempt to shake off these thoughts was futile. The truth hung over him like a shadow, a suffocating presence that grew with each new detail he noticed. And then came the night that would change everything. Sophie said she would have one more meeting, a company event that would extend beyond business hours. Ethan just nodded, without question, but something inside him set off an alarm. There was a subtle difference in the way she said those words, a hint of hesitation, as if she knew she was treading dangerous ground. He waited for her to leave, heard the sound of the keys, the sound of her heels clicking on the floor until they disappeared into the distance. And then, he made a decision. The impulse came like a storm, leaving no room for logic or the excuses he had been making for himself. He grabbed his car keys and left, his heart racing, as if he knew he was about to cross a line of no return. He didn't know exactly where to go, but something inside him seemed to guide him, a kind of instinct that led him straight to what he feared to discover. As he parked near the restaurant, his eyes immediately found her. She was there, sitting at a table next to the window, smiling in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. But that smile wasn't for him. It was for the man sitting in front of him, a stranger who shouldn't be occupying that seat, an intruder in the story Ethan and Sophie had built. He felt his chest tighten, the air become heavy, his senses sharpened to the point of making him unable to look away. It was real. There were no more doubts, no more room for illusions or excuses. The man reached across the table, his fingers touching Sophie's with an intimacy that Ethan recognized. She didn't back down. On the contrary, he held that hand gently, as if it were something he had been doing for a long time. As if that touch was familiar, part of a routine that shouldn't exist. The world around Ethan seemed to lose sound. The restaurant was still busy, waiters were serving customers, conversations and laughter echoed throughout the room, but none of that mattered. All he saw was his wife giving herself to another man, smiling at him, looking at him as if he were the center of her universe. And Ethan knew, right there, in that moment, that there was no going back. The pain came all at once, overwhelming, devastating. It wasn't just the betrayal itself, but confirmation that everything he feared was true. The woman he loved, the woman with whom he had shared years of his life, was there, in front of another man, in a meeting that shouldn't exist. And she showed no hesitation. She didn't look guilty. She didn't seem to remember that there was a husband waiting for her at home. Ethan felt his blood boil, anger mixing with pain in an overwhelming way. He could just walk away, pretend he never saw anything, wallow in denial like so many people did. But that wasn't the kind of man he was. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to do, and then walked through the restaurant doors. Every step seemed to echo inside him, a deafening sound that only he could hear. He approached the table, felt the impact of the moment when Sophie looked up and saw him there. Shock was written all over his face, his eyes wide, his mouth half open, unable to hide his fright. The man next to her seemed to stand still, not knowing what to do. Ethan stopped next to the table and took the ring off his finger, placing it on the white tablecloth with a calm but meaningful movement. The metal shined under the restaurant's light, a symbol of everything it once was, but in that moment it became just a memory. The silence between them was crushing. He looked into her eyes, looking for some justification, some attempt to deny what was happening. But all he found was hesitation, confusion, a belated guilt that was of no use. Ethan's heart was pounding, but his voice was steady when he finally broke the silence. "You're single now. I'm officially divorcing you." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Sophie blinked, as if processing what she was hearing, but there was no protest, no apology. She knew he didn't need anything else. What was done was done. The man next to her lowered his head, avoiding any confrontation, and the silence lasted for a few more seconds before Ethan turned his back and walked away. The night air hit his face as he walked through the door, but nothing eased the weight inside him. He felt like everything around him was falling apart, like he was just a shadow of the man he was before he walked into that restaurant. But something inside him said that wasn't the worst part yet. There was more. There was something he still didn't know. Something that would make it all even worse. And he was about to find out. The silence inside the car was suffocating. He drove aimlessly, the city passing in blurs around him, but his mind was stuck on the moment everything collapsed. Sophie betraying his trust, giving himself to another man, making that restaurant a stage for humiliation that he would never forget. But it wasn't just the betrayal that was pounding in his head. That was what came next. What would come now? Because something inside him screamed that there was more. A hidden truth, something he had not yet discovered. And I needed to know. He needed to understand what else had been taken from him without him realizing it. When he parked in front of the house, he felt the weight of reality fall on him. The house that was once his refuge, his safe haven, now seemed like a setting empty of everything it once represented. He pushed the door open and entered, the air feeling heavy, charged with a sense of finality. He climbed the stairs, each step echoing in the hallway, until he reached the room he had shared with Sophie for so many years. He looked around, the furniture, the bed, the pictures on the wall. Everything seemed intact, but inside, everything had been destroyed. That's when he heard the door open behind him. Sophie had arrived. He didn't turn around immediately, he just took a deep breath, trying to maintain control over himself, trying to contain the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to explode. But as he heard his tentative footsteps approaching, he knew there was no longer any room for restraint. "You shouldn't have come," he said, still not looking at her, feeling the tension spreading through the air. She was silent for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. I needed to explain." He let out a dry, humorless laugh and finally turned to face her. "Explain? What exactly? How did you manage to destroy everything we had without the slightest remorse? How did you manage to look me in the eye all these days and lie without hesitation?" She swallowed hard, hands shaking at her sides. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. But you need to understand, Ethan. It's not just that." He crossed his arms, anger and pain mixing in a storm inside him. "Isn't that all?" he repeated in disbelief. "What else could there be? Because honestly, I don't think there's anything you can say that's going to make this hurt any less." She took a deep breath, her eyes filled with something he couldn't identify. Fear. Blame. Despair. "I never wanted it to happen like this. I never wanted you to find out like this." "So how did you want me to find out, Sophie? Maybe when I came home one day and saw this guy lying in my bed? Or when you just decided to walk away and leave me behind like I never meant anything to you?" She closed her eyes for a second, as if absorbing the impact of his words. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. But there's something you still don't know. Something that I wanted to tell you, but I never had the courage." He felt a chill down his spine. There it was. Whatever it was, whatever was hidden, it was about to be revealed. "Then tell me, Sophie," she said, her voice firm but filled with a weariness he had never felt before. "Tell me soon, because I don't have the strength to play this game anymore." She hesitated for a moment, as if the truth was stuck in her throat, and then finally blurted out, "You no longer have any rights over our children." The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan, he blinked, trying to understand what those words meant. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice lower, as if he didn't believe what he had heard. She took a deep breath, tears threatening to fall. "The papers were signed months ago. I filed for full custody, and the judge accepted it." And it was as if the ground disappeared beneath his feet. He staggered back a step, the impact of those words hitting him with brutal force. "You did what?" he whispered, his heart racing, his mind unable to process what he was hearing. I thought it was for the best," Sophie said, her voice shaking. "We were growing apart, Ethan. I knew this was going to end, one way or another. And I didn't want our children to suffer through this." He felt anger rising, boiling inside him. "Better for who, Sophie? For you? For this guy you were having dinner with? How could you? How did you have the courage to decide something like that without even telling me?" "I knew you wouldn't accept it," she said, her voice a thread. "And I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to drag the kids into this." "Why, how convenient," he spat, his eyes burning with hatred and despair. "You anticipated the disaster of your own making and made sure I lost everything before I even knew I was being betrayed." She shook her head, tears now streaming down her face. "I swear it wasn't like that, Ethan. I just wanted to protect our children." He laughed, a bitter, broken laugh. "Protect? You took them away from me without even giving me the chance to fight for them. You tore away any rights I had over my own family and thought I would never find out." She took a step forward, as if she wanted to touch him, but he moved away, as if her touch were something poisonous. "I'm still their father, Sophie. You may have signed papers, but you'll never erase that." "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "And I know one day they will ask. I know one day they will want to know the truth." He took a deep breath, feeling the throbbing pain in his chest. And what are you going to tell them, Sophie? That I abandoned them? That I never cared? Or are you going to tell them that it was you who ripped me out of their lives? She lowered her head, unable to look at him. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the overwhelming pain that consumed him. He knew that nothing he said would change what was already done. But he knew one thing, he wouldn't let it end like this. Because no matter how hard Sophie tried to take him away from his own family, he wasn't going to disappear. He wasn't going to accept it. He would fight. Because if there was something she still didn't understand, it was that a betrayed man may bleed, but he never gives in without a fight. Ethan he felt a lump form in his throat as his mind tried to process what Sophie he had just confessed. The papers were already signed. The judge had already decided. His children were no longer legally his. The weight of those words hit him like a punch in the gut, robbing him of the air, making the ground beneath his feet feel unstable. His head was spinning, trying to find some logic, some explanation that would make this less absurd, less cruel. But there wasn't. Nothing could justify it. Nothing could fix it. Nothing could reverse the fact that the woman he loved, who he trusted, had already planned his downfall long before he even suspected it. She looked at him with teary eyes, but her tears meant nothing to him now. Had she ever cried before? Had he ever felt guilt when he went to court, when he signed those papers, when he destroyed his family behind his back? Would he have stopped for a moment and thought about what that would mean to him? What would that mean for their own children? Or had all of that already been decided in her mind for some time, calculated, planned, while she was still pretending to be his wife? He took a step back, as if he needed space, as if her presence in the room made the air unbreathable. His chest rose and fell at a rapid pace, his fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but with fury, with helplessness. Because she had disarmed him in every way possible. She hadn't just betrayed him. She hadn't just given her love and her body to another man. She had ripped his children away from him, ensuring that when the betrayal was discovered, he would no longer have the strength to fight for anything. You know what's funniest, Sophie? His voice came out cold, emotionless, as if he was distancing himself from everything he felt. I was trying to understand. Trying to find a reason. Something to explain why you did this to me. I thought maybe it was burnout, maybe it was something I didn't do, something that made you look for this guy. But now I see it was never about me. It was never about our marriage. It was all about you. About you wanting to get rid of me. About you making sure I had nothing. She closed her eyes for a moment, shaking her head as if she couldn't bear to hear it. That's not it, Ethan. No, he laughed, a bitter, disbelieving laugh. Do you really want to try to make it seem like something else? Do you really want to pretend that this was a mistake, a fluke? Because to me it seems like a very well thought out plan. You prepared everything. First you betrayed me, then you took my children away from me, and now what do you expect? For me to accept all this with my head down? I did what I thought was best for them, she said, her voice breaking, but he no longer believed a single word that came out of her mouth. Better for them, he repeated incredulously. Do you think that taking them away from their father was for the best? Do you think that when they grow up and know what you did, they will thank you for it? They will forgive you? Because I guarantee you, Sophie, one day they will ask. And when they do, I want to see what you will say. She lowered her head, her shoulders shaking slightly. But he didn't feel sorry. No more. Her tears were empty. If they had any meaning, he wouldn't have done what he did. Silence filled the space between them like an abyss. Ethan he felt his entire body vibrating, every muscle tense, every thought a tangle of pain and revolt. He needed to get out of there. I needed to breathe. I needed to find a way to reverse that, even if I knew the battle was already lost. He walked past her, ignoring the way she reached for him, ignoring the silent plea in her gaze. He quickly descended the stairs, anger pulsing through his veins, his vision blurred by the weight of the moment. He grabbed his car keys and left, the door slamming behind him loudly, echoing through the silent street. He drove without a destination, without awareness of time, just letting his emotions mix inside him, trying to find some logic amidst the chaos. The streets were almost empty, the sound of the engine filled his ears, but his mind was far from there. He tried to remember the exact moment when everything began to fall apart, the exact moment when Sophie stopped being his wife and became his tormentor. Could it have been months ago? Years? Had it all been a lie long before he realized it? The phone vibrating on the dashboard brought him back to reality. He looked at the name on the screen, feeling a bitter taste in his mouth when he saw who was calling. Sophie. The impulse to ignore was strong, but something inside him wanted to listen. I wanted to know what else she had to say. He answered, without saying anything, just waiting for her to speak. Ethan. Her voice was hesitant, as if she didn't know if she should continue. He remained silent. I know you hate me right now. I know nothing I say will change that. But I need you to listen to me. He let out a dry laugh. Hear what, Sophie? More lies. More justifications for what you did. That's not it, she said quickly. I know I hurt you. I know I ruined everything. But I need you to know that. I didn't do this alone. The air seemed to disappear for an instant. He frowned, trying to understand. What are you saying? I didn't plan this, Ethan. Not completely. I was influenced, she admitted, her voice cracking. He gripped the steering wheel tightly. By whom? The silence on the other end of the line lasted too long. Then finally she said, my lover convinced me to do it. He said if I took the kids away from you, everything would be easier. That way you wouldn't have anything to fight for. He manipulated me, Ethan. He made me believe it was the only way out. Her words echoed inside him, awakening something new. Something deeper than anger. Something more destructive than pain. Hatred. He felt his knuckles turn white as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. So that was it? You destroyed my life because this guy convinced you it would be easier that way? She started crying on the other side. I was stupid. I let myself get carried away. But now I see what I did. I see that he never cared about me, that he just wanted to destroy you. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, feeling every part of his body filled with silent fury. He wouldn't miss anything else. I wouldn't let this man get away with it. If this bastard thought he could destroy his life and remain unharmed, he was very mistaken. When he opened his eyes, his mind was already made up. He wouldn't let this story end like this. Someone would pay for what was done. The road unfolded before Ethan like an endless corridor, as his mind raced with chaotic thoughts. He could feel the weight of every word he had said on the phone, each revelation burying the blade of betrayal deeper. The lover was not just an intruder in their marriage. He was the architect of the disaster, the mastermind behind the destruction of his family. The rage inside him was something primal, something he had never felt so intensely. The idea that a stranger had so much power over his life sickened him. This man had not only stolen his wife, but convinced her to take from him the only thing that still mattered, his children. The city lights passed by him like shapes as he drove without a clear destination. The engine roared under the pressure of his foot against the accelerator, but he didn't even notice. The only thing that filled his mind was the need for confrontation, the need to face this man, to make him understand that he had destroyed the wrong life. Every detail was starting to fall into place, every little moment of doubt now had a darker meaning. It wasn't just Sophie's betrayal. It was the manipulation that happened behind the scenes, the decisions made without him knowing, the coldness with which his future was drawn up and erased without him being able to defend himself. He stopped in front of a luxurious building, feeling his chest rise and fall in a frantic rhythm. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from anticipation of the moment that was about to happen. Sophie had hesitated when giving him the man's address, as if trying to stop him from moving on, but it was too late to regret it. He got out of the car and crossed the sidewalk without looking to the side, his steps firm, determined, carried by the weight of accumulated anger. The doorman tried to stop him, but one look was enough to make him back away. He went up in the elevator without feeling time pass, just waiting for the moment when he would come face to face with the man who had destroyed everything. When the door opened, a long, silent corridor stretched out before him. Every step he took echoed off the walls until he stopped in front of the indicated door. The fist clenched before slamming against the wood, and for a moment, he wondered if he was supposed to be there, if it would change anything, if what he felt inside was just the impulse of someone who lost everything and sought empty revenge. But when he remembered Sophie's voice admitting what had been done, there was no hesitation left. The door slowly opened, and there he was. The man who had taken his wife, his family, his life. Daniel. The carefree face, the expression of someone who never feared the consequences of their actions. He didn't even seem surprised to see him there, he just let out a bored sigh before leaning against the doorframe. "I wondered when you would come," he said, with a slight smirk on his lips. The cynicism in the tone made Ethan's blood boil. He didn't hesitate. The fist closed and, in one swift movement, hit the other man in the face with enough force to make him stagger back. The thud of the body hitting the floor was muffled by the sound of heavy air inside the apartment. Daniel brought his hand to his face, touching the blood that dripped from his lip with a surprised look. But there was no fear. Just fun. He laughed, a low laugh, full of disdain. "Is this what you wanted? A moment of rage to ease your conscience?" Ethan entered the apartment, closing the door behind him. Anger didn't blind him, on the contrary, it made every detail seem clearer. The luxury all around, the impeccable decor, the smell of whiskey mixed with expensive perfume. Every detail of the place screamed power and arrogance. He looked around, imagining how many times Sophie had been there, how many lies had been told to justify her absences, how many smiles had been given without him knowing that they no longer belonged to him. "You don't know the pain you've caused," Ethan said, his voice lower but carrying a silent threat. Daniel wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand and slowly stood up. "Pain has always been inevitable. What did you think? That your marriage was perfect? That she was happy? I just showed you what was already happening." Ethan felt his fingers tingle with the urge to punch him again, but he held back. "You convinced the mother of my children to take them away from me. You destroyed my family." Daniel took a step forward, eyes assessing Ethan as if he were just another obstacle to overcome. "I gave her what you no longer gave. A reason to want something new. She just did what anyone would do, she chose what was best for herself." The anger inside Ethan turned into something sharper. He didn't need justification. "I didn't need to hear any more lies coming out of that man's mouth." He needed something bigger than a punch, bigger than a physical confrontation. He needed to take back what was taken from him. "You didn't break me," he said, voice firm. "You think you won, that you can move on as if nothing had happened, but I'm going to fight. I'm going after my children. I will reverse what was done. And you? You're just an insignificant detail in all this." Daniel's smile faltered for a brief moment, and Ethan realized he had finally struck something inside him. It wasn't fear. It was irritation. Because Daniel thrived on control, and seeing Ethan there, standing there, ready to fight, was something he hadn't anticipated. The silence between the two prolonged until Ethan took a step back, without taking his eyes off the man he despised so much. "Tell Sophie I'm not a man who gives up." And with that, he turned and left, leaving Daniel there, motionless, staring at the closed door. When he got to the car, he sat down in the seat and let out a long sigh, feeling the adrenaline still running through his veins. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't let his story end like this. He would fight for every piece of the life that was taken from him. And although there was still a long way to go, that was just the beginning. Ethan he remained sitting inside the car for a long time, his fingers still gripping the steering wheel tightly. The air inside the vehicle felt heavy, as if all the accumulated anger was still trapped there, swirling around him. The conversation with Daniel, it had been a necessary confrontation, but it was not enough. What mattered now was no longer the man who destroyed her marriage. It was about getting your children back. It was to reverse the dirtiest blow that Sophie had applied. No matter what was necessary, he would not accept being erased from the children's lives without fighting to the end. He picked up the phone and scrolled through the contacts, eyes fixed on the screen before finally pressing the number of the lawyer that had been recommended by a friend. The phone rang 3 times before a firm voice answered on the other end. "Mr. Carter, I need your help." Ethan's voice was serious, blunt. The lawyer seemed to sense the urgency in his tone and, after a few quick questions, arranged a meeting for the following morning. Ethan hung up, resting his head against the back of the seat, exhaustion weighing down his shoulders. There was no time to give in to tiredness. There was a lot to do. When he returned home, he found Sophie sitting on the living room sofa, her eyes red and swollen, as if she had spent the night crying. He stopped at the door, watching her for a moment. For a brief moment, he wondered who the woman before him was. Because the wife he knew, the woman he built a life with, was no more. What was left was a stranger who carried her pain and the weight of guilt. But that didn't change anything. She looked up upon noticing his presence, swallowing hard before speaking. "You went after him, didn't you?" Her voice was low, almost pleading. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "What did you expect? That I would accept all this silently?" He walked to the kitchen, got a glass of water, trying to maintain the calm he knew he still didn't have. Sophie followed him, stopping next to the counter, her hands clasped in front of her, as if she needed to hold on to something to keep from falling apart. "I didn't want it to be like this, Ethan," she said, and he felt a wave of irritation rise within him. "But it was like that, Sophie," he replied, turning to face her. "You betrayed me, destroyed our marriage, and then made sure I lost my children before I even knew what was happening. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. A conscious choice." She lowered her head, tears returning to her eyes. "I got carried away. I believed I was protecting the children. But now I see I was an idiot. Now do you see?" He shook his head, laughing without any humor. "Now that you've lost everything? Now that you realize you were used? Now that that bastard showed he never cared about you? Is this what made you realize you did everything wrong?" She took a deep breath, as if she wanted to rebut him, but nothing came out of her mouth. And he knew that, for the first time, she couldn't justify it. He took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers. "I'm going to fight for my children, Sophie. I'm going to reverse this decision. What about you? Are you going to be the woman who tried to erase their father from their lives, or are you going to make amends for what you did?" She pursed her lips, conflict evident in her expression. "What do you want me to do?" "You will tell the judge the truth," he said without hesitation. "You're going to admit that you were manipulated, that you made this decision without thinking about what was right. You're going to undo this shit you created." She blinked in surprise. "Do you think they're just going to nullify everything because I regret it? The system doesn't work like that, Ethan. I signed documents. The judge made a decision. Then you'll convince the judge it was a mistake," he said, his voice thick with determination. "Because if you don't, I swear I will go to hell to prove that you are not worthy of having custody of the children. I will expose every detail. I will show you what you did, who you did it to. I will make sure that, in the end, you are the one who ends up alone." Sophie's eyes widened, and he saw the shadow of fear cross her expression. "You wouldn't do that." "Try not helping me and find out," he replied, each word spoken slowly so she would understand he wasn't bluffing. She took a deep breath, tears streaming down her face. I didn't want us to get to this point. But we arrived, he cut in. And now you have a choice. The last one I give you. She didn't say anything else. He just nodded, slowly, as if his mind was finally understanding that there was no way out. Ethan knew there was still a long way to go. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was taking back control of his life. He had lost a lot. But I wouldn't lose everything. And this time, he would insist on being the winner of this battle. The court was silent when Ethan entered, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the tense environment. He felt every muscle in his body rigid, his nerves on alert, but his determination was greater than anything. Beside him, his lawyer was arranging the papers calmly, as if he already knew the outcome of that day. On the other side of the room, she was sitting, her face downcast, her hands clasped in her lap, as if waiting for the inevitable. She had agreed to tell the truth, but that didn't lessen the weight of the consequences of her actions. She knew this would be the day she lost everything she tried to secure for herself at Ethan's expense. On the bench next to her, Daniel was not present. His absence was definitive proof that she was completely alone. The hearing began, and Ethan remained impassive as his lawyer laid out every detail. The evidence was there, the documents signed, the manipulation evident. Sophie confirmed everything, her voice trembling, without trying to justify herself, without begging for mercy. It was too late for regrets. The judge listened, without expressing any emotion, but his words at the end were clear and direct. The previous decision was annulled. Joint custody was re-established, and Ethan now had the right to be present in his children's lives again. Relief coursed through his body, but there was no complete satisfaction. The damage Sophie caused couldn't be erased with a simple decision. The time lost, the sleepless nights, the tears shed, none of it would be returned. But at least he got back what really mattered. When the hearing ended, he stood up without even looking at Sophie. He no longer felt anger, not even contempt. Just indifference. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. He walked past her without caring. She was no longer part of his life. As he left the courtroom, he felt the sun touch his face, a strange feeling of freedom, as if he were finally coming out of a dark tunnel and breathing fresh air for the first time in a long time. He picked up the phone and called the only person he really wanted to listen to at that moment. The woman who was by his side in the last few months, who helped him get back on his feet, who was a point of light in the midst of so much chaos. Her voice answered on the other end, and for the first time, Ethan truly smiled. His past was buried, and before him, there was a new beginning. Meanwhile, Sophie walked out of the courtroom silently, her eyes glued to the floor, knowing that her life would never be the same. Her phone vibrated non-stop with messages from Daniel, but she didn't answer. She knew he had used her, that he never really cared, and now that she was no longer useful, he didn't even bother to attend the hearing. What was left for her now was just the shadow of a life she herself destroyed. The children knew the truth. Ethan would be part of their lives again, and she would just be the woman who tried to take them away from their own father out of selfishness and the influence of a man who discarded her the moment things got out of control. Her reputation was ruined, her friends shunned her, and she, who thought she was gaining a new life, ended up completely alone. Daniel, in turn, followed his path as he always did, without looking back. He was never the type of man who cared about the consequences of his actions. But what he didn't expect was for his own mistakes to come back to haunt him. His name began to appear in lawsuits, financial frauds came to light, clients he deceived began to expose the irregularities he committed. His image, once untouchable, began to crumble. And when he realized he was about to lose everything, there was no one else by his side. No friend to defend him, no woman to support him. Sophie, whom he had used so much, now ignored him. And Ethan, the man he tried to destroy, no longer needed to do anything, destiny itself took care of putting him in the place he deserved. Ethan started his life over without looking back. His children were with him, his new relationship was blossoming, and the pain he once felt was now just a reminder that he survived. He was no longer the man who had been betrayed, deceived, destroyed. He was someone who was reborn from the ashes, stronger, wiser. Because in the end, he wasn't the only one to lose something in that story. In fact, he was the only one who actually won. Now, I want to know what you thought of this story. Comment below your opinion and your vision about everything that happened. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now so you don't miss stories like this. Here, we do not support betrayal under any circumstances, because we know that the consequences always arrive, sooner or later. See you in the next story.